critique of Western linguistics runs the risk of generating a muddled account of the history of the discipline, i.e. we tend to read it as a progression of ideas towards more sophisticated and more scientific insights into the nature of language. On such a view, more contemporary theorists are believed to have embedded the best of their predecessors into their own theories and thus improved our knowledge of language. This idea of progress, similar to the idea of progress in the natural sciences, is however unwarranted when it comes to linguistics. Perhaps this has to do in the first place with the dubious claim that linguistics is a science. If we take Chomsky's concepts of competence and performance, for instance, there is nothing scientific about them, just as Saussure's distinction between langue and parole is not based on any science. Both Chomsky and Saussure believe in a science of language, though for different reasons. The former announced the supposed discovery of an invisible organ called the language faculty, thus assimilating linguistics to the biological sciences, whereas the latter postulated a hitherto unknown science which he called semiology. Linguists often regard competence and performance as having their counterparts in langue and parole. Chomsky himself believed so. But nothing could be further from the truth. Unlike Chomsky, Saussure did not postulate arcane syntactic rules that make up a native speaker's knowledge of language. Saussure's idea of a system of signs, what he called la langue, is made of the words that lay speakers use, albeit in the form of abstract signs. Crucially, however, Saussure's starting point to explain linguistic knowledge is the word, the basic unit, not rules of how to form grammatically correct sentences. Saussure's idea of language as a code has been the mainstay of modern linguistic theory. While the idea of rigid codes has been condemned by contemporary sociolinguists as a theoretical fiction, the truth is that linguists are reluctant to let go of abstractions, which after all allow them to analyze linguistic data. Contemporary scholars thus came up with the notion of repertoires or resources, i.e. linguistic codes that organize themselves when called for while disappearing when no longer needed, and reforming in different shapes again on other occasions. What is commonly questioned these days, in other words, is Saussure's idea of a fixed code. However, in Saussure's theorizing, the language code plays a clearly defined role. It enables speaker A and hearer B to communicate with each other, i.e. to understand each other irrespective of the context. Without such a fixed code, there would be no good reason for the disinterested theorist to claim that A and B communicated successfully with each other. In this way, the theorist can also explain unsuccessful communication, namely by postulating that A and B have internalized different codes, i.e. they belong to different linguistic communities. For example, dialectal communities. A speaks a different dialect from B, in which case we are dealing with two different systems, or langue. Before Saussure, languages were treated as nomenclatures. Historical linguistics, whose main representative in Saussure's days was the neo-grammarian tradition, was primarily interested in how words changed phonetically and morphologically throughout the centuries, in accordance with laws that were only visible to the professional eye. They were less interested in the things that these words denoted, because they didn't consider them as being subject to change. For instance, a wagon in the 7th century, after all, was still in substance a wagon in the 17th century. As a linguist, one only needed to account for the historical changes in the word form, while differences in the referential world could be left to archaeologists and historians to figure out. Saussure's genius consisted in proposing a completely new way of looking at what a language actually is. Saussure considered nomenclaturism, the idea that words signify by pointing to something outside of language, to be a categorical mistake in the history of linguistic thought, and hence his landmark idea of langue as an abstract system of signs, whose identities are purely given internally by the organizing structure. Thus, mutual understanding no longer required from the individual speakers to know what thing the word refers to. The system does it for them. The Saussurean concept of langue is inextricably bound to the concept of the linguistic sign. The latter, too, is treated by Saussure in a very unconventional manner. The sign does not point or refer, as lay people would have it, to some material manifestation, i.e. as one thing standing for another thing, as semiotician Charles Peirce would have it. The sign for Saussure is purely psychological, made of two indivisible parts, a sound pattern or image, the signifier, and a mental concept, the signified. Meaning, in a Saussurean sense, what the semiologist calls value is thus no longer part of the non-linguistic world, even though at the level of parole, i.e. linguistic interaction, speakers use words as if that is the case. Before Saussure, languages were believed to change through time, i.e. languages were conceived as having their own histories, and while changing into something very different, they still somehow managed to magically remain the same languages, because spoken by people of the same linguistic community across generations. Compare, for example, 14th century English with 19th century English, both spoken by the English-speaking community. Saussure acknowledged the psychological reality, which is the domain of langue, as well as a physiological and a physical reality, the latter two being part of parole. In the absence of one of these realities, no ideas can be transferred from one speaker's mind to another's. Sharing the system without communicating is just as vain as communicating without sharing a system. The concept of a language, as theorized by the neo-grammarians, is precisely what Saussure rejected on the grounds that historical linguists did not distinguish two separate perspectives, which Saussure termed synchronic and diachronic respectively. The language sciences, as institutionalized in 19th century Europe, had been founded, according to Saussure, on a fundamental epistemological error. According to Saussure, the linguist either takes the internal perspective of the language users of the community at any given point in time, the synchronic perspective, or he looks at single words from different systems and compares how they changed, the diachronic perspective. However, treating languages as comparable, as historical linguistics did, was precisely to mistake languages as abstract systems, the actual ontology of languages according to Saussure, for languages as lists of words referring to things outside of language, what lay speakers believe about languages. With its focus on the synchronic perspective, Saussure's linguistics was no longer committed to the historical material sciences, but was firmly grounded in the social psychological sciences. It thus took the genius of Saussure to realize that in linguistics it is the viewpoint that creates the object. In other words, taking an externalized diachronic perspective leads to a different object than taking an internalized synchronic perspective. These two perspectives are not just simply two facets of the same reality according to Saussure. Synchronic linguistics and diachronic linguistics deal with different objects. Unfortunately, modern linguistics treats diachronic linguistics and historical linguistics as synonymous terms, a mistake already committed by Saussure's contemporary Leonard Bloomfield, thereby ignoring Saussure's great intellectual contribution towards solving the conundrum of how linguistics, as a science, should define its object of inquiry.